The funeral hall was quiet except for the sound of soft footsteps and the low hum of whispers. People came dressed in black, their clothes neat and pressed as if they wanted to honor the man who had just passed away. The air smelled faintly of flowers, lilies, and roses placed carefully around the coffin. The coffin itself was polished and shining, holding the body of the man everyone had come to say goodbye to. Some guests walked up to it, bowed their heads, and wiped their eyes. Others stayed back, speaking in hushed tones about the life he had lived. He had been a man known in the community, a figure many respected. To some, he was a good neighbor. To others, he was a kind leader who had given advice when they needed it. To his family, he was father, brother, or uncle. Everyone had their own picture of him, their own story about who he had been. Yet as people gathered in small groups and shared their memories, there was also something in the air. A sense of performance, as if people were careful about what they said. Smiles looked polite but stiff. Tears fell, but some seemed forced. The church was filled with the sounds of quiet crying, the rustle of clothes, and the occasional cough. A pastor stood at the front, ready to lead the ceremony. He looked at the crowd with calm eyes, waiting for the right time to begin. Some of the younger guests kept glancing at their phones, trying to hide it, while the older ones sat straight, hands folded in their laps. The family of the deceased sat in the front row. Their faces were grave, their eyes red from crying. The widow sat at the very center, dressed in black with a thin veil covering her face. Her children sat beside her, holding her hands. Guests kept arriving, slipping quietly through the doors. Each arrival made the crowd shift, heads turning, whispers starting again. People studied each other's faces as if trying to see who had come and who had not. For some, this funeral was as much about being seen as it was about saying goodbye. Old friends reunited with polite handshakes. Old rivals nodded coldly across the room. The atmosphere carried both grief and tension, like a storm waiting to break. As the pews filled, the murmurs grew louder. People told small stories about the man, stories meant to honor him. "He was always there when someone needed help," one woman whispered. "He had such wisdom," another added. But not everyone agreed silently. A few looked away, avoiding the conversation, as if they knew something deeper, something others did not. Children shifted uncomfortably, too young to understand fully why everyone was so serious. Some tugged at their parents' sleeves, asking when they could go home. The parents hushed them quickly, reminding them to be respectful. The smell of candles burning mixed with the fragrance of flowers, and the whole place felt heavy, as if the walls themselves carried the weight of sorrow. The coffin, resting at the front, became the center of everyone's gaze. Some people stared at it with genuine sadness, others with curiosity, and some with unreadable expressions. Death had a way of bringing people together, but it also had a way of pulling out secrets and hidden emotions. In the silence between whispers, it almost felt as though the coffin itself was holding more than just a body. It was holding truths yet to be spoken. The pastor finally cleared his throat, preparing to start the service. The crowd grew quiet instantly, every sound fading away. It was the silence of respect, but also the silence of waiting. Everyone leaned slightly forward, expecting prayers, speeches, and stories that would paint the man in glowing colors. The family braced themselves, ready to hear words about their loved one, words that might comfort them or remind them of what they had lost. In that moment, the hall looked complete. The guests, the family, the pastor, the coffin, everything seemed in its proper place. Yet somewhere in the back, a faint sound of footsteps echoed. The doors creaked open slowly, though no one paid much attention at first. People assumed it was just another late arrival. After all, funerals often had stragglers, someone delayed by traffic or someone too emotional to come in earlier. But what no one realized was that this arrival would change everything. This quiet step into the room, unnoticed by most, would soon shake the polished image of the deceased man. The gathering seemed ordinary, filled with tears, flowers, and memories. But hidden beneath the surface was something no one was prepared to face. And so the guests waited, unaware that the funeral they thought they understood was only just beginning. The heavy doors of the church creaked again, and this time people noticed. A few heads turned as an elderly woman stepped inside. She was small in frame, her back slightly bent with age. Her skin was dark, lined with years of hardship, and her hair, streaked with gray, was pulled back into a simple bun. Unlike the other guests, she wore no fine clothes. Her black dress was faded, almost threadbare, as if it had been folded in the back of a closet for decades and pulled out just for this day. She walked slowly, carefully placing one foot in front of the other, clutching a small worn handbag in her hands. Her shoes were scuffed, and with every step they made the faintest sound on the polished floor. The guests closest to the door glanced at her, then quickly looked away, whispering to each other. No one greeted her. No one smiled at her. To them, she did not seem to belong. She moved toward the back pews, her head slightly bowed. She did not try to sit among the family in the front. She did not even try to join the middle rows where friends of the deceased gathered. Instead, she chose a seat in the farthest corner where shadows stretched across the wooden benches. She sat quietly, placing her handbag on her lap, her wrinkled hands folded over it. Her eyes looked straight ahead, but every now and then she glanced at the coffin. Her gaze lingered there longer than anyone else's, heavy with something deeper than grief. Around her, whispers began to spread. A woman leaned toward her neighbor and whispered, "Who is she? I've never seen her before." The neighbor shrugged, frowning slightly. "Maybe she's just a stranger who wandered in. Some people come to funerals for free food." A man in the row behind smirked quietly and shook his head, muttering, "She doesn't look like she belongs here." The family in the front row did not even turn around. To them, the presence of the elderly woman was invisible. They were too focused on their own grief, or perhaps they chose to ignore her deliberately. Still, the guests could not stop sneaking glances at her. Something about her quiet presence stirred curiosity, maybe even discomfort. The pastor began to speak, his words flowing through the hall, but the woman in the back seemed to listen more carefully than anyone else. Every word about the man's kindness, his generosity, his noble life, she absorbed it with an unreadable expression. Sometimes her lips pressed together, as if holding back a thought. Sometimes her eyes glistened, though no tears fell. She reached into her handbag and pulled out an old, folded envelope. Her thin fingers traced the edges of the paper gently, almost with reverence. She held it tightly, then slipped it back inside. Nobody saw the action except for a child sitting a few pews ahead. The boy turned to look at her with innocent curiosity, but his mother pulled him back around, whispering harshly, "Don't stare." The elderly woman sat perfectly still after that, like a shadow against the wooden bench. She did not fidget. She did not shift in her seat. It was as if she had been waiting for this very moment, this very day, for years. Yet no one approached her. No one asked her name. To them, she was a ghost among the living, a figure in the corner who did not deserve attention. But if anyone had looked closer into her eyes, they would have seen something startling. Her gaze was not empty. It was not lost. It was sharp, steady, filled with a truth that seemed too heavy to carry alone. The guests thought she was just another forgotten soul at the back of the church. But the truth was, she knew the deceased better than almost anyone in that room. She had come with purpose, and though no one realized it yet, her presence would soon turn the funeral upside down. And while others whispered behind her back, the woman simply waited. She knew her time would come. The doors at the back of the church groaned open, and for a brief second the sound cut through the pastor's calm voice. People turned their heads, expecting a late friend or another family member rushing in. But instead, an old woman stepped across the threshold. She was unlike anyone else in the room. While the guests wore fresh black suits, polished shoes, and elegant dresses, her clothes told a different story. Her long black dress was faded, its edges frayed, as if it had lived through decades of Sundays and funerals before this one. The scarf tied around her head had lost its color long ago. Its fabric thinned from countless washes. She carried no bouquet, no polished Bible. No signs of belonging. Only a small, cracked leather handbag clutched tightly against her chest, as though it guarded something far more precious than money. For a moment, silence spread as eyes followed her. But just as quickly, people turned away, exchanging quiet whispers. One woman leaned into her husband's arm and said, "She must be lost." Another murmured, "Strange she came here. Did he even know her?" The husband gave a dismissive shrug. No one welcomed her. No one moved to make space in the middle rows. She was not invited, and the way the crowd ignored her made that truth clear. The old woman didn't flinch. She lowered her gaze and walked slowly, her step steady, though her body trembled slightly with age. Every shuffle of her worn shoes echoed faintly against the marble floor. a rhythm that felt almost out of place in the grand, solemn hall. Instead of stopping near the center, she drifted toward the shadows at the very back. She sat alone in the last pew where no one else dared to sit. From there, her view stretched across the entire gathering. She saw the widow seated in the front row, face veiled, hands trembling as she gripped her children's fingers. She saw the polished guests who filled the pews with stiff shoulders and sorrowful masks. She saw the coffin, so carefully decorated with roses, that seemed almost too beautiful to belong to a man of flesh and mistakes. But her eyes did not move quickly like the others. They lingered. They searched. Her gaze carried weight, the weight of someone who did not come for show but for truth. The guests pretended she was invisible, yet some couldn't help sneaking glances. A young man near the aisle frowned, whispering to his sister, "She doesn't look like she belongs here." The sister shrugged but stole another look anyway. The children, more honest in their curiosity, stared openly until their parents tugged them away with sharp whispers of, "Don't stare. It's rude." The pastor's voice rose again, filling the hall with praise for the man's kindness, his wisdom, his honorable life. Applause broke out softly after each line, but the old woman in the back did not clap. Her face did not glow with pride. Instead, her expression was unreadable, a mixture of sorrow and something sharper, something that made her jaw tighten. Her thin hands reached into the cracked handbag, pulling out a folded envelope. Its edges were yellowed with time, its surface creased from being opened and closed too many times. She stared at it for a long while, running her fingers across the faded ink on the front. Then she tucked it back quickly, as though the very sight of it burned her heart. No one noticed except a little boy sitting 3 rows ahead. He had been fidgeting with his shoes when he saw her hands move. His wide eyes lingered on her, filled with questions. But his mother pulled him back, scolding in a whisper, "Don't look. Stay quiet." The old woman returned to stillness. She did not fidget, did not shift her weight, did not look for attention. She sat like a shadow that had always belonged to the church but had never been seen. Her silence was louder than any whisper in the room. If anyone had dared to study her eyes, they would have felt a chill. For her eyes were not the eyes of a stranger. They were the eyes of someone who had lived a story no one else dared to tell. She was not there to mourn politely. She was there to speak, but the crowd didn't know that yet. To them, she was nothing. An unnoticed guest. A forgotten figure in the corner. What they didn't realize was that she carried a truth sharp enough to cut through every lie spoken that day. And before the service ended, every single person in that hall would be forced to look at her. The service went on, the pastor's voice echoing softly through the church. But in the back row, the elderly woman sat in absolute stillness, while others nodded along to the speeches and wiped their eyes for the sake of appearances. Her face told a different story. She did not smile politely at the compliments. She did not cry when others did. Instead, her sharp eyes followed each person who stood to speak. She watched the widow in the front row, her veil trembling, as silent sobs shook her shoulders. The children pressed close to their mother, their small hands wrapped around hers like roots clinging to soil. To anyone else, this scene looked heartbreaking, a picture of a grieving family. But the old woman's gaze lingered, not in pity, but in knowing. She studied the widow's every movement as if weighing whether her sorrow was real or staged. One by one, friends of the deceased rose to share their stories. A neighbor spoke of his generosity, of the time he gave money to repair a broken roof. A co-worker praised his honesty and leadership. A cousin laughed about his sense of humor, bringing a ripple of forced chuckles from the crowd. Each word painted the man in glowing light, smoothing his flaws into perfection. The guests nodded, agreeing aloud, but their eyes betrayed something else. Small flickers of doubt, awkward silences before applause. The elderly woman saw it all. Her eyes darted from face to face, catching every insincere smile, every glance that slid quickly away. She noticed the way one man clenched his jaw when the word honest was spoken. The way another woman crossed her arms tightly when someone called him faithful. These details slipped past everyone else, but to her they were loud as thunder. She could see who was pretending. She could see who knew. Her hands rested on the handbag in her lap, the envelope inside pressing against her palm like a heartbeat. She tapped her fingers lightly on the leather, not out of nervousness but out of patience. It was not yet time. She was waiting for the moment when silence would no longer be enough. A group of women sitting a few rows ahead whispered among themselves. "She hasn't looked up once," one hissed. "It's strange. Almost like she's angry," another shrugged. "Maybe she doesn't even know him." "Some people just want to be seen." Their words floated back, reaching the ears of the old woman, but she did not react. She did not turn her head or frown. Instead, her eyes stayed fixed on the coffin. The coffin itself was dressed in white roses and silver trim, shining beneath the dim light. To most, it was a symbol of final rest. To her, it was a box of secrets, a prison holding not just the man's body but the lies he had left behind. Her gaze hardened every time she looked at it, as though she could see beyond the polished wood into the weight of his hidden sins. She leaned back slightly, her fingers folding together. She listened carefully as the pastor spoke of forgiveness, of legacy, of leaving behind a good name. His words rolled smoothly across the hall, but in her ears they were sharp, like knives scraping against stone. She closed her eyes for a moment, and memories flickered. Memories of laughter that turned into silence, promises that turned into betrayal, love that had once burned like fire but had been buried in ashes. When she opened her eyes again, the room looked different. She no longer saw a funeral of mourning. She saw a theater, a stage where every actor played their part. The grieving widow, the proud relatives, the loyal friends. And like all theater, she knew the script was only half the truth. Her lips pressed into a thin line. She said nothing, but the fire in her eyes spoke for her. She had come to watch, to listen, to measure the weight of every false word spoken that day. And when the moment came, when she finally chose to break her silence, no one in that church would leave with the same picture of the man lying in that coffin. For now, though she sat in the shadows, the unnoticed guest, the silent observer, watching, waiting. The service moved on, but the air inside the church began to feel heavier. The speeches, the prayers, and the songs carried on, yet not everyone was listening anymore. Attention kept drifting toward the back pew, where the old woman sat in silence. At first, people had ignored her. Now curiosity began to spread like a quiet fire. It started with whispers. A pair of women leaned their heads close, pretending to wipe tears while their voices stayed low. "Who do you think she is?" one asked. The other shook her head, frowning. "No idea, but she looks out of place. Look at her dress. Looks like it came from another time." A man across the aisle joined the whispering, his voice sharp with suspicion. "Maybe she came to the wrong funeral. People like that sometimes wander into places just for food." His wife nudged him with her elbow, signaling for him to stay quiet, but her eyes still flicked back to the old woman with unease. Row by row, the murmurs grew. Some guests craned their necks, trying to get a better look. Others whispered guesses. Maybe she's a distant relative. Maybe she worked for him once. Maybe she's just crazy. The words carried a sting, and though they were soft, the old woman seemed to hear them all. She did not move. She did not defend herself. She sat still, her hands folded over her handbag, her expression calm but unyielding. The silence around her only made the whispers grow louder. In the front row, the family noticed too. The widow, hidden behind her veil, leaned toward her eldest son. "Do you know that woman?" she asked, her voice trembling. The son shook his head quickly. "No, mother. She's no one." But even as he said it, his eyes lingered on the figure in the shadows. He could not shake the feeling that she was not a stranger at all. The pastor's words floated above the growing tension, but they no longer held the crowd. The guests shifted in their seats, torn between pretending to mourn and secretly trying to unravel the mystery of the unnoticed guest. Every few minutes, more heads turned toward the back, some with curiosity, some with suspicion, some with something close to fear. A boy near the aisle whispered too loudly, "Why is she staring at the coffin like that?" His mother hushed him quickly, pulling him against her side. But the question lingered in the air. Why was she staring? Why had she come? The old woman lowered her eyes briefly as if in prayer, but her lips never moved. Her silence was not the silence of grief. It was the silence of someone holding back, the kind of silence that felt heavier than words. And as the whispers spread, unease settled in the room. The funeral no longer felt smooth and polished. The speeches sounded thinner. The smiles looked weaker, and the air seemed to hum with something unspoken. Guests began to sense it, even if they could not explain it. This funeral was not going to end the way it began. They told themselves she was no one, just an old woman sitting quietly at the back. But deep down they knew. People like her did not sit in shadows without reason. She had come for something that would not stay hidden much longer. The pastor closed his Bible and looked over the crowd. His voice softened as he said the familiar words. If anyone wishes to share a memory of the departed, you may come forward now. A gentle pause filled the church. For a moment no one moved. The guests sat stiffly in their pews, eyes darting between each other, waiting for someone brave enough to rise first. Finally, a young man stood and walked to the front. His words were smooth, polished, the kind of words that made people nod politely. He spoke of kindness, of leadership, of a man who gave more than he took. When he finished, he returned to his seat to a small wave of applause. Then a woman rose, wiping at her tears. She told a story of how the man had once helped her in a time of need. The guests smiled softly. More people followed, each one adding another brushstroke to the perfect picture of the deceased. The funeral became a stage of praise, the coffin glowing brighter with every compliment. And then it happened. At the back of the church, the old woman stirred. Slowly, she pushed herself to her feet. The sound of the wooden pew creaking under her weight cut through the air like a crack of thunder. Heads turned instantly. Conversation stopped. The atmosphere shifted as every eye fixed on the shadow rising from the last row. Her steps were slow but steady as she walked down the aisle. The click of her worn shoes echoed louder than the polished ones before her. Each step seemed to tighten the air. Guests leaned toward each other, whispering, "Who is she? Why is she going up there? Does she even belong here?" The family in the front row stiffened. The widow's hand gripped her son's arm tightly. The son's jaw clenched, his eyes narrowing. No one moved to stop the woman, but the silence around her was sharp, almost hostile. She reached the front at last, her small frame standing beneath the light. For the first time, the guests saw her fully. Her dress may have been worn, her hands thin and trembling, but her eyes were steady and unbroken. They carried the weight of someone who had come not to praise, but to reveal. The pastor hesitated. His polite smile faltered as he looked at her, unsure whether to welcome or dismiss her. But before he could speak, she placed her handbag on the podium and rested both hands on its edges. Her voice, though frail, rang clear. "I knew him," she said. The words seemed to hang in the air, echoing louder than they were spoken. The guests froze. The silence was absolute. "I knew him," she repeated, her voice stronger this time, in a way none of you here truly did. A ripple of shock moved through the crowd. People shifted in their seats, glancing at each other, searching for answers. The polished image of the man inside the coffin flickered like a candle in the wind. The old woman's eyes swept the room, resting on the widow, then on the coffin itself. Her lips pressed tightly together, as if choosing carefully whether to keep the truth buried or to set it free. And in that silence, in that single breath before her next words, the guests understood. Whatever she was about to say would change everything. The silence inside the church was so deep it felt alive. No one coughed. No one shifted. The only sound was the faint rustle of flowers brushing against the coffin as the air moved. The old woman stood firm at the front, her worn dress swaying slightly as she drew a slow breath. Her eyes wandered over the crowd, pausing on the familiar faces, on the polished family sitting in the front row, on the man's coffin shining beneath roses. Then, her frail voice broke the silence. "You all speak of him as though he were a saint," she began, her tone calm but sharp, kind, honest, faithful. "But I knew him in a way none of you did. I knew the man behind the mask." Gasps rose from the pews. The widow's head snapped up, her hands tightening around her son's arm. The children stared wide-eyed, while the pastor shifted uncomfortably, his polite smile gone. The old woman placed a trembling hand on her handbag and pulled out the envelope. Its edges were yellowed, its folds deep as though it had been opened and closed 1,000 times. She held it up for all to see. "This," she said, her voice cracking with both pain and strength, "is his handwriting." His words, his confession. The crowd leaned forward, hungry and horrified. Whispers spread like sparks. "Confession? What does she mean? What is she talking about?" She pressed the envelope to her chest and closed her eyes for a brief moment, gathering courage. When she opened them again, they burned with fire. Long before his wife. Long before this life you all knew, she said, I loved him. And he loved me. We were young, foolish, but it was real. Real enough to bring life into this world. The room seemed to shudder. Some guests gasped openly, while others shook their heads in disbelief. The widow's lips parted as if to speak, but no words came. Yes, the old woman said, her voice firm now. We had a child, a son, flesh of his flesh, blood of his blood. But he turned his back on us. He buried us in silence, just as he now lies buried in this coffin. Gasps became murmurs. Murmurs became cries. The family sat frozen, pale and stiff. The old woman's voice shook with sorrow as she continued. That child? He never grew to be a man. He died young. He died without a father's name, without a father's hand to guide him. And still the man you praised stood tall in your eyes. Still he smiled. Still he built his life while leaving us in the shadows. Tears finally slipped down her wrinkled cheeks. Her hand gripped the envelope tighter, knuckles white with memory and pain. Before he passed, he wrote this letter. He sent it to me. In it, he begged forgiveness. He confessed what he had hidden all these years. He knew the truth would follow him to his grave. She raised the letter high, her voice cutting through the room like a blade. And now I bring that truth to you, to his family, to his friends, to everyone who thought they knew him. You deserve to know the man you honor today was not only what you say he was also the man who abandoned a son who carried his silence to the grave. The church erupted. Some gasped and cried out. Others shouted, lies! This cannot be true! Yet no one could look away from the envelope shaking in her hands, from the fire in her eyes that could not be faked. The widow trembled violently, her veil falling aside to reveal her pale face. The eldest son stood abruptly, his fists clenched as if ready to silence the old woman by force. But he stopped himself, frozen by the weight of the crowd's eyes, and through it all the old woman did not move. She did not shrink. She stood like stone, her voice steady now. This coffin holds more than a body. It holds secrets. It holds sins, and I will not let them be buried in silence any longer. The coffin, once glowing beneath flowers and praise, now seemed darker, heavier. It was no longer a symbol of honor. It was a tomb of hidden truth. And for the first time, every person in that church realized this funeral was not only about mourning a man. It was about uncovering the truth he had tried to take with him. The church exploded into chaos. The air that had once been heavy with silence now shook with voices, sharp, angry, trembling, and afraid. Some gasped so loudly their cries echoed against the walls. Others whispered furiously to one another, their heads snapping back and forth as if trying to piece together a puzzle they never knew existed. No. It can't be true, someone shouted. She's lying. Impossible, another guest hissed. I knew him my whole life. He wasn't like that. But for every denial, there were eyes filled with doubt. Guests looked at one another with uneasy suspicion, faces twisted with shock, brows furrowed, lips quivering. Some refused to believe, but deep inside, they could not shake the weight of the old woman's voice, or the letter she held trembling in her hands. The widow's chest heaved as though she couldn't catch her breath. Her veil, slipped off earlier, lay crumpled on her lap. Her pale face was drenched in silent tears. She tried to speak, but only a broken whisper escaped. How could he? The eldest son leapt to his feet, his hands clenched into fists. His voice boomed across the hall. This is blasphemy. This woman is here to shame our family. Do not listen to her. His words rang strong, but his eyes, wide and restless, betrayed fear. He looked at the letter as though it were a weapon pointed at his heart. Guests leaned away from him, not in support, but in discomfort. They could hear the anger in his voice, but they could also hear the trembling underneath. The younger children clung to their mother, their eyes wide with confusion. They didn't understand the words, but they understood the fear. Their small voices whispered, "Mama, what's happening?" The pastor standing beside the old woman shifted uneasily. His hands trembled as he held his Bible tighter. He had led dozens of funerals, spoken words of comfort for countless grieving families, but never had he faced something like this. He opened his mouth to calm the storm, but his words faltered before they began. Even he didn't know what to believe. In the pews, old friends of the deceased exchanged dark glances. One man stared at the floor, his lips pressed tight as if the woman's words confirmed something he had always suspected. Another woman bit her lip, her face pale, remembering something long buried. Secrets began to stir in their minds, things they had noticed but ignored, hints they had brushed aside. The whispers grew sharper. Could it be true? Was that why he always avoided certain places? Did anyone else know? The more questions filled the air, the more the coffin at the front of the church seemed to change. It no longer shone with honor and respect. It seemed heavier, darker, like it carried not just a body but a weight of hidden sins pressing down on everyone in the room. The old woman stood unshaken at the front, her back straight though her hands trembled around the letter. Her voice rose above the chaos, firm and clear. You can call me a liar. You can turn your faces away. But the truth does not die just because you wish it gone. He left this world with a confession, and I carry his words. The letter shook in her hands, but her eyes blazed with a fire that silenced some of the crowd. She was frail in body, but in that moment she towered over them all. The family sat frozen. The widow wept quietly. The eldest son seethed. The younger children shook in confusion. Around them the guests split into sides, those who denied, those who doubted, and those who silently believed. And in that storm of disbelief and fury, the truth hung in the air like thunder waiting to strike again. The church had fallen into a storm of whispers and broken voices. But slowly, as the old woman held the letter high, the noise began to fade. One by one the murmurs died until the hall was silent again. All eyes were fixed on her. The frail figure who had walked in unnoticed was now the center of everything. Her voice trembled but did not break. He wrote this to me before the end. He begged for forgiveness. He asked me not to let his story be buried in lies. These are his words, not mine. She unfolded the letter carefully. The yellowed paper shook in her hands, but her eyes were steady. She began to read. The words spilled into the air, written in the handwriting of the man lying in the coffin. He confessed the love he had once shared with her, the child he had abandoned, the shame he carried every day of his life. He spoke of mistakes that haunted him and the regret that never left. His final lines were a plea. Forgiveness for her, forgiveness for the child who never had his name, and forgiveness from those who thought they knew him. As the old woman read, the room shifted. The guests, who had moments ago been full of doubt and anger, now sat in stunned silence. Some covered their mouths. Some lowered their heads. Even those who wanted to deny it could not argue with the man's own words staring back at them. The widow wept openly now, her tears soaking her veil. She held her children close as though she too carried the weight of the truth he had hidden. The eldest son, once fierce with anger, sat down slowly, his fists unclenching. His face was pale, his eyes glassy, as though the ground beneath him had given way. The pastor took the letter gently when she finished, his hands shaking. He looked at the guests, his voice heavy with humility. The truth has been spoken. We came here to honor a man, and we still may, but let us not honor him with lies. Let us honor him by facing him as he truly was, flawed, broken, but human. The old woman closed her eyes, tears streaming silently down her cheeks. She did not gloat. She did not smile. She had not come to destroy, but to reveal. Her shoulders sagged with the weight of finally letting go of the truth she had carried alone for so long. And then something unexpected happened. Slowly, one guest after another began to rise, not in protest, not in anger, but in quiet respect. Heads bowed, hands folded. Even in their shock, they understood. She had given them more than a scandal. She had given them honesty. The old woman turned once more to the coffin. Her lips quivered as she whispered almost to herself, "Rest now, at last in truth." For the first time since she had entered the church, she was no longer invisible, no longer overlooked. Every eye was on her, every heart weighed down by her words. She had been the shadow in the corner, but now she was the voice of truth, the final witness to a life that could not hide forever. The funeral, once meant to bury a man with glory, had become something greater. It became a reckoning, a reminder that even in death truth finds a way to speak. And when the old woman finally turned to leave, no one dared to whisper. No one dared to doubt. They simply watched her walk away, knowing they had seen not only the end of a man's life, but the beginning of his truth.